Live. Welcome to the MedTech Innovator Webinar Series 6 today. We will be discussing on PR and brand management. Before I introduce our moderator, here are some housekeeping notes for our cohort. Do rename yourself in Zoom with your name followed by your company name, and also some housekeeping notes for our cohort. Do rename yourself in. If you have any questions along the way, do click on the Q&A button and key in your questions. Our webinar will be live on YouTube and LinkedIn. All questions will be answered during our closed-door Q&A session at 11 a.m. Now, let me kick off the webinar by starting to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Frederick Nyberg, who is the Managing Director of MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific, and he will be moderating this session and asking your questions. Frederick, please.
Thank you, Bernice. Good morning, everyone, and good evening for those of you dialing in from the US. Very warm welcome to our webinar number 6. We are, as Bernice mentioned, we're covering a critically important topic today that often gets overlooked in startup circles in the early stage of when most people in the organization are focused on technology and clinical work and so on. We will be talking about public relations and brand management, specifically for medtech startups. We have a great panel here. We'll introduce them here in just a moment, representing both the US. We'll get a US perspective on things as well as an Asia Pacific perspective. For those of you who are watching this live on YouTube, just a quick reminder, we are hosting these webinars on Thursdays, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Singapore time. The first hour is live streamed on YouTube. We then go into closed door Q&A with our cohort. The next webinar in our series, if you want to mark your calendars, is on the 12th of October. That will be on MedTech manufacturing, design, and engineering. Just before we get started, a few quick words about MedTech Innovator, who we are and what we do. We are the world's largest accelerator for startups in traditional medical devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics. Well over 600 companies globally will have gone through our accelerator program at the end of this year. Those companies have gone on to raise more than $7 billion US in follow-on funding. And you have the opportunity to meet all the 24 companies that are in our APAC cohort if you join us at the APAC MedTech Forum during our showcase and grand finals, 5th to 6th of December here in Singapore. And please get in touch with us if you are either keen to apply or be part of our ecosystem. Now, with that, let me introduce you to our panelists. I'm thrilled to have Laura Nobles here joining us from the West Coast of the US. Laura is founder and chief persuader at Pazanga Health Communications. She'll introduce herself in just a moment. And here, locally based in Singapore, is Emma Jenkins-Lee at Spurwing Communications. Some of you here in Singapore may be familiar with Spurwing. I think you are the largest healthcare-focused public relations firm here in town, if I'm not mistaken. But I'll have Emma tell us more about that in just a moment. So maybe, Laura, let me turn to you first. Tell us a bit about yourself, your company, what you do, and your background in marketing communications, and typically how you work with startups and smaller companies.
Yep, absolutely. So as Frederick said, I'm the CEO of Pazanga Health Communications. We're a healthcare-only marketing and PR services firm, and we work with a whole roster of clients from startups to brand names, and work across different clinical segments. So we've got a very broad level of expertise. To share what services we offer, the easiest way for me to say that is we do pretty much everything except IR, investor relations. So we have, for clients who need sort of an outsourced marketing department, we do branding, we do design, we do digital websites, social media, traditional media, kind of everything and in between, depending on what a client needs. So we've been around 17 years, I'm happy to say. And I'm not going to tell you how old I am. But I've been in PR and marketing my whole career. The last 22-ish, I would say, focused specifically in healthcare. I came out of tech and I fell into med tech, and I just found my home and I never went back. I just love this industry. I love being on the ground floor of new technologies. Obviously, healthcare is an intensely personal thing. And it's really rewarding to be part of this industry personally. I'm sure everybody on this call being part of the industry, if you've had friends and family members who probably call you and ask you, do you know how I can treat this? Or do you know a doctor about that? Or what's the latest technology for this? And it's such a great thing to be able to have. So I've worked with MedTech Innovator. This is our second year being a partner in the ecosystem, although I've known Paul and Catherine for a very long time. And I'm really pleased to be part of this program. I just think it's an exceptional accelerator program. I've never seen anything like it. And I think that that for those of you who are in this year's cohort, you're going to have a bright future, no doubt.
Thanks, Laura. And I think you did have the opportunity to meet some of our cohort companies in San Francisco at the MedTech Innovator Summit back in June.
Yes.
So thank you for that. Emma.
Thank you. Good morning,
welcome.
Good evening to everybody online viewing and listening today. So actually very similar to Pasanga, Spurwing Communications is an independent agency based here in Singapore, and we are specializing in what we like to say is two of society's most important commodities, health and food. We started out not as old as Pasanga, but 2015. And really it was started by our CEO and founder, Emma Thompson, with a vision to bring specialist knowledge to this industry and the communications in this industry in particular, having looking at the healthcare and the highly regulated market that it is. It does require specialist knowledge and a specialist way of communicating. I guess our mission with that is very clear for us. It is to ensure that we make a meaningful contribution to people and our clients and the communities in which they work. Very similar to Pasanga and Laura, we're a full service integrated agency. So again, we do everything apart from IR as well, Laura. We have a team of expert communicators that really span a wide range of backgrounds, everyone from frontline healthcare, healthcare people, in ex-pharmacists. We have ex-journalists, as well as of people that of course worked in communications for most of their careers. So we kind of combine all of that, the deep sector knowledge. We have scientific writers, and how do we land narratives and messaging for our clients. Me personally, again, actually, I didn't realize that Laura and I have quite similar backgrounds. I was in tech for many, many years, B2B techs more specifically, and then kind of found my way into healthcare. And I think that, as with any industry, technology is touching everything and everyone. So what's been really interesting as I made my way into healthcare is being able to apply that tech knowledge, but also a slightly different outside perspective, having not worked in the healthcare industry previously. So I have racked up almost 2 decades in the communications industry. 16 of those have been here in Asia Pacific. I was in Hong Kong for 10 years and I've been in Singapore for 6 years. Asia is very, very much my home, and having spent most of my career here navigating the fragmentation of this market. So what I hope is that you're all able to take something new away today that may help you as you look at your businesses.
Terrific, Emma. Thank you. Thank you both for that introduction. Before we dive into the details here, let's just talk briefly about, at a relatively high level, what some of the key marketing communication trends are in the US and in APAC. And obviously we've just been through the pandemic, and that created a bit of a havoc in terms of marketing communication and how healthcare companies sold products, and the ability or the inability to visit clinicians and run trials, with elective surgeries being postponed and so on. And we're seeing a lot of that coming back. Laura, let me start with you. What are some of the high level trends in marketing communications you're seeing in the US, and how has it shifted now post the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I'd like to start with the pandemic first, to just kind of explain to folks what the environment was like in the US, because it changed everything so dramatically. I mean, I know it did all over the world. But as you know, we rely in the US medical device companies a lot on our sales reps being able to be on site with the physicians, particularly if they're for surgical procedures, things like that, or just, basically for selling. And that was curtailed. And then the other piece was, from a public relations standpoint, there was no coverage of anything in healthcare, period, end of story, that did not relate to COVID for a very long time. I remember we had a client at the time that was actually a previous cohort in MedTech Innovator, a very successful company. They have a augmented reality system for spine surgery. And we were just about to launch them. They'd gotten FDA clearance, and then COVID happened. And what I found out later, they kind of, tamped everything down, shut down the program with us. And then I found out later that they were in the middle of doing a deal, and the investors got spooked and just, kind of went away. But this was an astonishing thing that happened. Well, the employees were so vested in the company and the technology that even in this time of uncertainty, they collectively put $4 million into the company. The COO created another entity to fundraise that way, and that closed the deal with the investor. And as an entrepreneur, people on the phone listening to this story, you think, wow, that's something a reporter would want to write about, right? No one cared.
Interesting.
No, it was just a very odd time. The other piece too is that, and this affects all of us. I mean, I work from home. I worked from home before the pandemic, but now journalists are mainly working from home. And so it's very hard to reach them. And, they get thousands of pitches a day from media, from PR people. And, a lion's share of them are probably not very good, but they're incredibly busy. I think the last time I checked, they're writing something like 7 stories a day on the national level. They just don't have time. And it's interesting to me, when I started my career, there were actually fact checkers at media outlets that would call and say, I want to fact check this. Can you tell me if this number is right? I want to fact this quote. Is this okay? That is so ancient times. Now it's not uncommon to see a typo in the Wall Street Journal, which just boggles my mind, but it is what it is. So it changed the landscape in terms of what's an interesting news story. We still have COVID here in the US that's still dominating headlines. We're still getting emergency use authorizations from the FDA, which actually is kind of surprising at this point, but it's still here. We are able to break through the noise. There definitely is vast reporting on everything else healthcare. But I think that, clients that were in infectious disease or in some way, helping patients with immune system deficiencies or things like that were kind of the early winners coming out of pandemic. And I still think that's the case today.
And probably companies working in respiratory disease or maybe telemedicine as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
They got a lot of attention during that at that time.
Absolutely. And I think also that, when you talk about COVID and the cytokine storms that happen to the body and the body overreacting, it's a very similar story to sepsis. And so there's been a lot more awareness of, I think, sepsis in the US lately. There's changing guidelines. I don't know if people on the call know this, but cancer patients mainly die of sepsis because their immune systems are so shot. So it's just kind of interesting, like what's become interesting. And I think the other piece that is a trend here in the US, and this is before COVID, but still now, is that, the convergence of tech and med tech is real. There are no dumb devices. And one thing Paul Grant said to us, we were interviewing him for an article, and he said, data is the new oil. And I said, that's a great quote. He said, well, it's not mine. I've heard it before, but it's just so interesting that, smart devices, data, like the whole landscape has shifted in terms of how where companies need to focus early on and who's going to pay, where's the value going to lie. So I say this as a communications professional because we have to navigate all of these trends as we're coming up with, messaging for our clients or strategy, and I think it's really, I think, made us even more disciplined in that regard. So in terms of like overall communication approaches, I think, a lot of the things that we were doing in the past, we're largely still doing. I think, social media is kind of, evolving here in the US. I think for our clients that are more on the B2B side, they kind of stick to LinkedIn. Twitter used to, but maybe people are like not understanding X yet. But for those that are B2C, you know, it makes sense. But I think that, you know, it's as important as ever to get your story really nailed, because there's a lot of noise in this market. And, you know, if you can't cut through with the story that's validated and actually, it resonates, then it's going to be very difficult to make a difference.
Right. Well, thanks for that, Laura. And we'll certainly come back to social media here later in our discussion. Emma, your perspective from Asia Pacific.
From Asia Pacific. I mean, I think I kind of want to just build on Laura's point about kind of the story. You know, when I started out 20 years ago, you know, media were maybe writing one story, two stories a day, and, you know, at best, right? And it's almost like the actual building of a story and landing the story is harder than it ever was before. And, you know, it's almost as the advent of digital, for me, kind of traditional communications, whether building relationships with media or building a really great compelling story, has kind of been lost. So it's become even harder to, you know, bring people through kind of the communications ranks and get them to kind of, I think that's, you know, obviously one element of a challenge through the advent of digital, and building a compelling story and ensuring that it actually can land. As Laura says, there is so much noise, 7-8 stories a day, less media now than there ever was. But I think, just thinking more broadly about COVID, I mean, I often, you know, we joke now, like, did COVID ever happen? Honestly, I mean, when we look at the world and how quickly we've all kind of got back to the way things were, we kind of had, at least that certainly feels like, I mean, maybe the people on this call would maybe agree, disagree. Look, some things, flexible working, things like that, you know, whether the journos are in office, working from home, all of that, of course. But, you know, for us, people are trying to avoid. I mean, I was at a conference yesterday and somebody mentioned COVID on stage and they apologized for mentioning COVID. Everybody is trying not to mention it. It's like it happened, it's gone. We've got COVID fatigue. There are, I think, the perspective here, at least from what I hear when I'm out on the circuit and listening to people speak, is that, okay, it was huge. We understand it was huge. We've learned a lot of lessons. We've come through it. But on the flip side, so many things got ignored because of it. And people want to start shining a light back on big issues, you know, be it other diseases, other vaccines, women's health. I mean, huge on the agenda here in Asia Pacific, you know, so many of these things. I mean, diabetes here in Singapore, you know, we were looking at some data, you know, the progress the government has been making towards diabetes and prevention and care. They think they're kind of set back about 18 months here now because of the pandemic. So it's kind of, it's not forgotten, of course, you know, it was an awful time for many people, but from a healthcare perspective and healthcare company perspective, everyone's trying to veer away from even mentioning in a post-pandemic world. Nobody writes that. If you write that to the media, forget it. Your pitch will be ignored. If your opening line is in a post-pandemic world, don't use it. Don't use it. And so I think that is very much the mindset, and particularly as we build stories, of course, everything is about being newsworthy, and COVID is no longer newsworthy. So we have to move on. I think perhaps one thing I was mentioning earlier is that the thing that did change, I think, for healthcare companies for the better for them in terms of communications is them being seen as perhaps a little bit more trustworthy for the skeptics out there. Instead of billion-dollar, you know, profit-making giants, through the pandemic, they've, I think, gained back some trust from the public as everybody came together and worked towards getting the vaccine to us. So I think that's a positive upside in terms of coming out of COVID. You know, that the healthcare companies feel more confident in their public messaging, more empathy, I think, through that messaging, and also the healthcare companies more broadly, internal comms perspective, you know, not forgetting about those employees. I think Laura mentioned kind of, you know, a lot of these companies having to, you know, their livelihoods depend on kind of being out on the road and, you know, selling. And I think that keeping, you know, motivation levels for these healthcare companies high was huge. I mean, when I looked at the turn of our work, it became probably similar to you, Laura, it became crises. and a lot of it became internal comms. So
Mm-hmm.
and so that's kind of COVID and the, you know, my perspective on kind of the post-pandemic world. I think more broadly in terms of trends, and these aren't just specific to the pandemic, but we saw a lot go online, of course, during the pandemic times. I would say that's changed again. We're back to kind of physical meetings, physical presence. You know, it's busier than ever being out and about. But online obviously is still huge, but not for the purposes of instead of in person. So I think a couple of trends that I see is influencer marketing and the use of, you know, micro or macro celebrities, as we like to call them. You know, we use a lot of influencers in our work for someone like Medtronic, where we've done campaigns around varicose veins and using a local celebrity to kind of talk about that hugely resonates and works for a lot of the Southeast Asia markets. And then similarly, I think content marketing, I speak to, you know, HCPs who want to use online tools like TikTok to communicate in bite-sized, you know, way to educate the general public about something, you know, be it cancer, a disease, you know, the vaccine, you know, why should you take it? Just very short bite size. You know, I've got HCP saying I want to be on that platform, you know, to see that the wide use. And the final thing I would say is, we've always talked about localization in Asia Pacific. Of course, you know, with the spread of markets, you have to be local with your messaging, but I would say hyper localized now. And one thing that I would, you know, really urge people to kind of take on view is in these big markets like the Philippines, Indonesia, we're talking city level, but then we're talking rural level. So the hyper localized messaging and who you're talking to is like ever present now, and you really have to dissect each of your markets to think about who are you talking to and how does the message need to land. You know, we know in urban cities, affluent middle income, you know, families, that's a very different message to somebody in rural community where maybe education is still really important. So I think they're the biggest trends that we see in Asia Pacific.
Great, thanks a lot for that, Emma. That's really really interesting. We'll come back to several of these points in our discussion here in a moment. Now, as I think you're aware, we at the beginning of the accelerator cohort, we reached out to our companies and that are on the call now and asked them to list specific questions that relate to PR and communications and to other related to other business topics, of course, as well. And one company came back to us and asked, how can I build a global brand? And that's probably as general and as high level a question as you can get. But where does a startup really begin? Because the early days of a medical technology startup, the focus is going to be on the technology. It's going to be on the maybe the clinical work, and it's unlikely at the early stages of a medtech company that they're thinking actively about developing a branding strategy. So what are your recommendations? When should a company start to think about this? And how does a company start to develop that branding strategy, and where do they really begin? And maybe Laura, I'll turn to you first on this.
Yeah, I actually love that question. I was like, that's a very big, audacious question that somebody just asked at the startup level, because there's so many things that go into building a global brand that have nothing to do with marketing and everything to do with execution. You know, so there's that. But I think, you know, last year we had a similar webinar in the US, and somebody said, you know, why do I need branding to sell to, you know, my doctors? And, you know, obviously you need to have awareness about who you are for people to, you know, express interest and, you know, have a brand, have a message that's going to resonate. And I think one of the things that I love about MedTech Innovator is the value exercise, the value program that you have with your companies, because we do something similar, but it's really much more skewed towards communications with all of our clients, no matter where they are in their life cycle. And that is really just doing a very solid messaging exercise up front to make sure that we really understand what is the unmet need in the market, who's our target audience, like what's keeping them up at night. How is your technology truly different, and not just because you're in love with your technology, like really peeling back that onion. The other piece, and I'm sure you see this in Asia Pacific too, and this is something I've talked about for years, is the sameness of message across the board. So you can take, somebody's device and they have 3 or 4 companies that are either real or perceived competitors, and you put their language side by side, and they're all saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so no one's gonna, that's just a recipe for disaster. So, it's actually one of the more fun things we do is just really get very disciplined in peeling back that onion and really trying to figure out, okay, let's get at the heart of this. And I think to the value program, I think that's a genius thing you do with your companies. And it's for much more than communication, but it makes them understand what is the value proposition. And how am I going to get someone to purchase this? It's so comprehensive. And I think it's great because I've heard from cohorts that have graduated that they keep that sheet for years and they keep looking at it, and it helps them articulate their story and kind of articulate their strategy. So I want to say that first and foremost. But the other thing I would say too is that, and we'll get into this a little bit later about sort of what your end game is with the startup, there are multiple avenues for exit, right? Do you want to get bought? Do you want to go public? Like, what do you want to do? And that can inform your brand strategy too, because I see a lot of startups that have their corporate brand, then they've got the product name, and then they've got like this secret sauce inside name, and then, then the software name and name soup. And I know we have a question about this later. But I think that it just, if you have a good counselor, at this stage of your company, really kind of trying to explore what it is you're trying to do, who you're trying to create awareness with, why, when, those are all good things to ask yourself.
Very helpful, Laura. Thanks for that. Emma, your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, and I think I concur with everything that Laura says, whether you're doing that exercise from the US or you're doing that exercise from anywhere in Asia Pacific, it is exactly the same. And when we go through that process, we often pick out the competitors, and we kind of we put it up side by side. And, you're so right. Like, when it's your company or you're building or part of building something, you do drink a lot of the Kool-Aid, and you really do have to be honest with yourself. And I think that often we meet people that feel like it's an easy exercise, and it really isn't. And again, coming back to in the amount of noise that's out there, I think that identity and the differentiation, it's hard, even as marketing communications agencies, we have to do the same exercise. There's so many of us, it's a difficult exercise, but I think if you can crack it, it's hugely valuable. And I mean, the startup market is flooded, the media are cynical. Why do I talk to you? Why are you different? Absolutely. So that I completely concur with, and that doesn't differentiate. Maybe I can just look at it from a lens of maybe building a global brand for a US company coming into Asia Pacific, and thinking about what does that mean? And again, having worked whether in tech or healthcare over the years, I think you really have, I speak to people and say, oh, we're going to do Asia Pacific. And it's like, okay, well, where in Asia Pacific are we starting? It's like, well, no, everywhere. And, we might kind of start in Singapore, but I kind of want a helicopter coverage and view of maybe Southeast Asia. And I have to really say, when you want to build a global brand, you have to go step by step. You have to put your boots on the ground in one market in Asia Pacific. It's highly unlikely you can do more because funding is always a challenge. And I think you need to be thinking about what's the end game? Where's my business? And where do I need to, which market I'm going to start in? Often Singapore is the place because it's very friendly from an international perspective. It's also the innovation center of Southeast Asia. I can definitely say it definitely leads in terms of, the trends, the excellence, the best practice. So people tend to land here first, but I think you have to understand what you can do from Singapore and the reach into other markets as you build your brand. And I guess that's where the regulation and the compliance side of things is, the depth of knowledge you have to have when you're building from the US into Asia Pacific, again, is exceptionally deep. So I think you need to think about which market, why, and then understanding that market in a lot of depth.
Yeah, no, that's very useful. And I think that's relevant for companies that are based here in the region as well. We have cohort companies that may be based in Japan and wish to enter Australia, or Australian companies that wish to enter China, or Indian companies that want to enter Indonesia. So it's really the same set of challenges, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Again, the fragmentation, the differences in these markets. We're going to cover. I think we're going to cover off kind of the compliance and regulation side of it later. But again, they're just wildly different between Japan and Australia, and Japan and India, and
absolutely. Coming back to and maybe before I turn back to Laura on this question, just a quick reminder to our cohort. Please queue up your questions. Either use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, or raise your hand, and we'll get to those during the Q&A here during the last 30 minutes. Laura, you touched on this briefly, the soup of brands. Sometimes companies brand they really push hard for the name and the brand of their company. Sometimes they push very hard for the brand of their product. What are some of the thoughts, some of the considerations a company should take into account here? Because you can either, I guess, be a branded house where you go out and if you're Nike, you go out and push Nike, of course, or you can have a portfolio of different brands where you push different products or different subcategories of products and their unique brands. What are some of the considerations here for a startup when they start to think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that a lot of the startups, think about, how many brands they want to have, or they don't think about brand at all. Or they've got a terrible name of the company because it was like a nickname that somebody did in a research lab somewhere. I'm not joking, but that, that may sound fun, but it's just, that's not a way to name your company. We actually had a client years ago, they've changed their name now, but it was Calhoun Vision, and they had a light adjustable lens for cataract surgery. And we said to them, what is the Calhoun? What does that mean? And you know what it was? The founder lived on Calhoun Street. So they've changed their name. I forget what they changed it to, but it's much more akin to what their business is. But I think, just pay attention to the name. And I think we talked about this a little bit before we got on the call about how difficult it is to actually find names now that aren't taken in your domain. So a name is important. I just would say that. And then, for a startup that's looking to exit, I guess look at your product portfolio when you think you're going to want to get bought, for example, and how many resources do you have to be pushing the brands? A lot of time you have to stay really focused and really pushing, if it's the initial product and you're building data and you're building customers and you get through your regulatory clearance and you've got reimbursement and then you want to get bought right then, now's the time not to start floating out 20 different brands. But sometimes you've got a platform, right? And you can brand the platform, but the platform's going to spawn multiple opportunities, right? So it depends on each company and what they're trying to accomplish and what their actual technology is. But I think it's a good question to ask yourself, but don't feel like you need to fall in love with branding everything. That's not a good thing to go, because, people have no attention span, myself included. I mean, I think the latest number is something like US adults consume 14 plus hours of media a day. So unless you repeat something to me many, many times, I'm not going to remember it. And so if I have to remember like 5 brand names versus one, focus on the one.
Makes sense. Emma, we spoke about regulated markets, particularly in APAC, and I wanted to ask you about some of the high level, some of the key differences, things to think about if you're a startup. What are the regulations specifically for in terms of direct to consumer or direct to patient marketing? Is it allowed? Is it not allowed? What are some of the key differences, and perhaps how does it differ with the US?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a huge difference between what is permissible in advertising in the US versus Asia Pacific, and then obviously a huge difference within APAC markets as well, right? So with a lot of them really prohibiting direct to consumer advertising, particularly when it becomes to more prescription treatments, for example. I also just want to add on, in addition to kind of country regulatory requirements, the channels used to market to consumers also have their own requirements. So, for example, advertising devices or any medical products on Facebook continues to become more and more challenging. And there was just new restrictions, I think, released last week in terms of what you can say and who you can target, via that platform. So there are in-market country regulations at the government level, and then there are channel regulations. So there's a huge amount of complexity. But I think just perhaps what might be useful for the audience is to kind of just maybe give a couple of examples where we see kind of some of the highly regulated markets. Japan is considered one of the most stringent regulatory environments for pharmaceuticals and medical devices. One example is a company, and they're not somebody that we directly work with, but Inspire Medical Systems, which is a company spun out of Medtronic. They manufacture implantable devices for the treatment of sleep apnea. Now, they received approval for its product in Japan in 2018, but actually didn't fit its first device in Japan until February 2022. Now, that is you can really see the difference in terms of, okay, you're approved, but then the steps and the process you have to go through to even getting to fit the first device. So I think that's really, really, extreme kind of case in terms of the markets in Asia Pacific. Singapore also has very stringent regulations governing particularly in the pharmaceutical and med devices space as well, and Singapore are looking a little bit more towards the end of the year in terms of the medical devices, the regulations around them, what's going to be reimbursed as well. And then on the flip side, you've got markets that are less stringent, like India. And an example, I guess, not on the med device side, but just more broadly, they had a recent example in the beginning of the year with tainted cough medicine, and that really shone a spotlight on the lax oversight of regulation from pharmaceutical companies. So the medical device sector is evolving in India. I'm not an expert in the India market, I have to say, but there is an introduction of medical device rules now. So I think, again, if India is a market, I would definitely advise people to take a look at those rules, and of course seek kind of local boots on the ground. But it really does vary between that lax kind of approach maybe in India to Japan, where we see it hugely stringent. But I guess, regulations, you need to kind of seek, I guess, the expertise as a healthcare company operating in each of those individual markets, and ensure that you really understand the local regulatory requirements, and engage with legal and regulatory experts, I think, to ensure to be fully compliant and ensure your product won't get pulled.
Makes sense. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Emma. Laura, I want to come back to the topic of value and how does a startup typically best communicate that value, and how important are patient stories, which is something that we see more and more of, and I guess you many of your clients might be developing those as well.
Yeah. Well, let me answer your first question, because they're both important. In terms of developing the value story here in the US, it's tough, because not only do you have to be effective and safe, you have to save money at the same time.
Right.
And you have to have someone willing to pay for your device. Right. So it's tough. I mean, I think that's where we work with our clients. And that's why I also think, Paul talking about the importance of data, not only clinical data, economic data, building those things in your story, because that's the value, right? You want patient satisfaction, you want efficacy, you want safety, and you want cost savings, right? So I would say, focus on those as you're developing your value story. And then for different audiences, there's going to be different elements of that story that are more important. So when it comes to, a hospital CFO or whatever, they're going to want to see the economics, right? Or is there net new revenue coming in from something? It's about the numbers, sadly, but it's a business here, right? So It's a business of care. When it comes to the patient stories, those are important depending on what kind of company you have. Sometimes, your technology is going to be in the part of the care continuum where the patient will have no clue that your technology is being used, and that's fine. There are others where the patient will know, right? And it's going to have a meaningful difference to them. So, having, say, there's a new technology that treats, I'm just going to throw something out there. So we have a client who just got FDA approval for a new technology that treats different spinal conditions that normally require fusion. No patient wants fusion that I've ever met. So that's, and you talk about patients coming out of the procedure, being able to walk, being able to bend down quickly, those kinds of things. Patients relate to that story and they say, oh my gosh, I want that. Right. So for example, there's another cohort company in the US is a client of ours named Sparta Biomedical, and they've got artificial cartilage that they're developing. And their first application is going to be a knee implant to basically give patients more time before they have to get a knee replacement, because so many are uncomfortable, they're not active enough and whatever, and they want something, but they don't want a whole total knee replacement. And so they have to do a PMA study. They're very early on, but like literally we got a corporate profile in a trade publications for them, and patients started calling. And the editor said, I've never had so many inquiries ever about a technology. So it's just interesting, patients, depending on what it is you have, can be very desperate. There's another cohort company, InBrain Neuroelectronics, who, I'm not making this up, like literally this week, they announced they got breakthrough device designation for their technology, their neural interface for treating Parkinson's, and they have not done their first in human yet. And I got an email from somebody saying, I want to delay, how can I get this, So patients are, and I think we talked about this too before the call, that consumer behavior is changing. With the internet. People are searching for things. They want to, if they hear another patient have a good experience with something, they're more apt to want to get it. But those are for technologies, again, that touch the patient. The patient's aware that it's, impacting their care, versus something a little further upstream where it may help the clinician tremendously, but the patient doesn't really need to know. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, Laura. I appreciate that. We have just over 15 minutes left, and I did want to move on to the topic of public relations. And there are a couple of really good questions that were posed from our participating cohort companies. And Emma, I'll turn to you for this one. A company is asking us, one of our cohort companies is asking us, how do we get established as a thought leader in our space? What can a startup do to be perceived as a thought leader? What are some of your quick thoughts and suggestions on that topic?
So, I mean, this actually applies to everybody in any industry. Again, it's throughout my career, it's something that I feel people think that it's easy to do. It is, again, not easy to do. And it takes time. I have to say, it's a long-term build, establishing yourself as a thought leader. And the one thing I would say throughout my career, and I'd love to hear Laura's perspective as well, is you have to have something to say, and you have to have something different to say. Now, when I say different, I don't necessarily mean controversial. Controversial, of course, works, but it doesn't have to be controversial. You just have, I think someone who really has deep industry knowledge, who can identify a niche. You have to kind of identify a niche. What am I really great at talking about? What is my passion? And how does that differ to what somebody else is talking about? Try to find the white space, the nascent space, if you can, for sure. Because again, we come back to noise. Everybody's saying the same thing. So I think have an opinion. Don't be, I think, again, from a brand perspective, people are afraid to share an opinion because it, from a reputational perspective. But again, use people like myself and Laura to kind of, check all of that, make sure that it's, that it's measured. But you can have something different to say, but you have to want to work at it as well. It's not a two-way street. Again, I get a lot of people that, want the agency or the communicator within the agency to kind of build that for them. Leadership is very personal. For me,
Right.
it's about, if you want to be a leader, you have to kind of showcase so we can do it together, but it's a two-way partnership from an agency perspective and the client perspective, and it requires investment and time. So I think using your deep industry knowledge, where's your passion, where can you find a niche that maybe someone else isn't talking about, quality of the content, for sure, absolutely, and wanting to invest the time to put yourself out there, be it speaking engagements, and be it social. LinkedIn works great from a leadership, particularly from a healthcare B2B perspective. And it's the one channel I would say works across majority of Asia Pacific, when you're not getting down to the consumer lens where you have to go in market channel by channel, but it can work. But you have to want to invest the time. And as I say, have something to say. And I think also be willing to kind of start at the ground up again.
Right.
I have people saying, I want to be on the Economist panel discussion. I want to be in Bloomberg. You get invited to those things because you've built a profile. So you have to be prepared to start on the bottom rung. Let's do some of the more industry specific events, kind of get your name out there, build the profile, and then you can work up your way up the ladder. And as long as you have something fresh, a different perspective, you will get noticed, you will get picked up. But this could be a year-long campaign, going from nobody knowing who you are to being invited, or really being seen as somebody who someone wants to hear. It's a journey, and one that requires time and investment.
Right. Would you suggest, Emma, to get friendly KOLs involved as well? Are they helpful? Do they play a role in this?
In thought leadership?
Yeah.
Personally, from a branding perspective, no, I think for me, it's about the leader, it's about the brand.
Yeah.
I would use KOLs for different things.
Okay.
But it comes down to, particularly for a startup, people are interested in the person behind the startup as well. Like, what have you got to say? What's your story? So that's incredibly important. You don't want to dilute the emphasis on you or the brand by giving the voice to somebody else.
Good point.
One thing I would say too is that you really have to ask your why, because the other piece is you don't want it to be blatantly commercial is the reason that why you want to get out there, right? It really, and some people, and you have to be honest with yourself. Do you have the kind of personality that commands that? Are you good on camera? And there are other ways of doing it. You don't have to be on camera for everything, but I think it's a deeper question of the why. And then I agree with everything Emma said in terms of the personalization, the build, it takes time. It's just everything you said is correct.
And it is authenticity, you're right. And some people are natural at it. So then what is the other way? Is there somebody else in your company that can do it, that you're okay with doing it? If you just, I think, be honest with yourself. Like, this isn't me, and it's too forced. So let's find the other way. Never be pushed into thinking that it's something, again, I think you really have to think about, are you the face of the brand, or can the brand survive without you being the face of it? Can we build the brand without that? So, yeah.
Great advice there. Thank you. And a question we've touched on briefly, but I wanted to ask you nevertheless, typically from your perspective, what makes a story newsworthy? When you pitch for a story to be published, what are news outlets typically looking for, and how might that be different from a morning paper versus a trade journal? Because they're obviously looking for quite different things. And is it a lot easier getting into a trade journal? I suppose it is, than let's say the morning paper or Channel News Asia here in Singapore. And maybe Laura, I'll ask you to comment on that first.
Oh, yeah, thank you. This is fresh in my mind, and because I had this conversation with a client today, and this might sound a little academic, but I'm just going to say it anyway because I think it rings true. I learned years ago, and I don't remember where, what the construct is for a good story that Gannett developed a long time ago. And there's 4 things. There's the news, what's happening. There's the context, why should I care? There's the impact. How many people does this affect? How many dollars am I talking about? And then there's the personal, the face, right? Which in healthcare is a lot of times the patient. So I think, basically these medtech companies are our clients, but what I like to impress upon our clients is that the media are also our clients. We are selling them things of value, stories. We are not there to smile and dial and just, say how great our companies are, because that'll turn them off. You have to give them something of value. They're looking for things that's going to drive clicks, readership, views, all those things. And you really have to understand with the journalists, what are they writing about? How do they like to write? But I think all of those story elements really need to be there. So for example, without naming names, we have a client who is about to get FDA clearance, and it's for a technology that's going to identify a particular health condition way, way earlier than in normal diagnostic pathways. And so the second paragraph of the release, after it announced, okay, we got clearance for this technology, was, okay, currently this many people have this condition. When it's not caught early, here's what happens. Here's how much it costs to the healthcare system, all these things, and they're all sourced. And so we were laughing today because one of the people internally was like, it's way too long. It's way too long. So they wanted to take out that whole paragraph. And we're like, you just took out the so what? So I think you have to have all of those components in there that make a good story. Like, what would you like to read as a consumer of news? We all read news. Like what has an impact on what you read, So I think those elements are really, really important, and understanding, that being honest with yourself about, okay, is this news really, is this like A level news? Is this B level news? Kind of categorizing that way, because you're not going to get in the Wall Street Journal for hiring a new CFO, for example.
Makes sense. Emma, your thoughts on that, and maybe you can comment on maybe some of the differences between mainstream media and trade journals here in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one element I would obviously add for Asia Pacific is the local angle for any story, for any market. Look, and every market will say they're parochial. They are. These are my consumers in my, like, what's of interest, and what's of interest to a consumer in Singapore is very different to what is interest to a consumer in China. So I think the local element is imperative. That's always the so what and the why, right? So from a mainstream media perspective, I think context is everything. I think in the bigger picture, as I always tell my clients, like, how do we set what you're doing in the context of the broader world? And maybe what's the human interest element when it comes to broader daily coverage? And why does the average consumer care? When we're in businesses, we always think we are not the consumer. When we're sitting here devising messaging and stories, you do it with the lens of, well, I'm the buyer. No, you are not. You have to always take yourself out of that. That's, I think, one of the biggest things that we forget to do is, this is your company. You are not the consumer. So as we build the story, you have to kind of change your lens. So from a main daily perspective, you have to think about the context and the human interest at a wider level. And then from a trade perspective, you can get more technical with your detail, right? The main dailies, that these journalists are generalists. Yes, there are healthcare reporters at the daily newspapers, but again, coming back to writing 7-8 different stories a day, they don't have that technical level of understanding. They don't have the time to understand it as well. So you really have to craft that story. But with the trades, you have a bit more time, and I would say the trade stories don't always have to be as time sensitive as the daily stories, and again, depends what type of, story you're putting out there. Is it a news piece, or is it just an opinion piece, which we have more time to build that story in? So I would say for me, they are big differences.
Very, very, very helpful. One question I did want to ask you, and again, I think it came up from one of our cohort companies. We see a lot of startups being in stealth mode. In other words, being quiet, below the radar, not wanting to publicize much about what they're doing and what they're working on, and sometimes, of course, that can be linked to them being in the process of filing patents and so on. What are do you come across this sometimes, and what are what's your advice? What we as a non-brand management expert, I sometimes see startups that I think are staying for too long in stealth mode, when they really should be out there spreading the gospel. Do you see that? And what are some of your thoughts on staying silent for too long? And what could be some of the key milestones that would trigger a major PR event for a company? And Laura, maybe I'll turn to you first on this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've seen this, and it varies on the reasons why. Maybe they just feel from a competitive standpoint, they really just don't want to say anything, or frankly, they're so, heads down on developing their product and getting it through regulatory that they just don't think about communication. And that happened to us recently with a client, and it was very difficult because we were getting into FDA clearance in like 2 weeks after our initial conversation, and trying to, build a presence. If there's no presence, it's like, how do you get people to pay attention? Well, I don't know who this company is. I don't know what the issue is, that kind of thing. So you really have to hustle in that regard. But I think, there are certainly milestones that, particularly in the regulated, device industry, when you get breakthrough designation, or when you start a clinical trial, or you're first in human, or things like that, that when you're actually really doing something and you're out there, you're in a hospital, or you've gotten the FDA to do, grant you something, that's the time. Once you start achieving some milestones, I mean, you don't want to say, hi, we invented this and put out a news release. That makes no sense. But it's like when you're actually having just like the slightest bit of traction is when you should start building a name for yourself. And you don't have to give the whole story away, but you want to get your name out there. You want to get people to understand what it is you're working in, why, so that they can start anticipating, okay, I see this company is doing interesting things, and they see a cadence of progress coming out from the company. Then they really want to watch the company, So I think it is, depending on the circumstance. I mean, I'd be happy to talk to somebody if there's some real true reason to stay stealth for a really long time. But I think that it's a mistake generally.
Do you thanks for that, Laura. Emma, do you see that in APAC as well?
Actually, I've just been going through this process with the company that we started talking to maybe 6 months ago. And when we met them 6 months ago, we were talking about, how do we build the narrative? What's the story? And honestly, I've met them 4 or 5 times, and it's been fun, happened to know this person from another company, and, we've got a good relationship. And as we've gone through the process, we've kind of, I initially, when I met them, I thought, oh, you're good to go, and then I met them maybe just a month ago. And as I reflect, I think actually you weren't good to go, but you're now really, really good to go. And they don't want to go. And I think it's for the reason from a competitive standpoint.
Okay.
But it's really interesting. Even I reflect, even after 20 years, thinking when I initially met, let's start thinking about what the narrative is, what's the differentiation. But actually, as I've had conversations going on, I've realized that, you're not quite ready, understanding the internal barriers potentially as well. But then in this final meeting, thinking, the final meeting, the product, the medical device was on the table. And I was so impressed. It's great. And I thought, wow, you're good to go. And they were like,
right.
Actually, no, we're going to wait. And I was like, okay, but it's here. You're good to go.
Right.
Let's start building the story. And so, I think we do see it. And I think it is from that nervousness of being new to market and wanting to have everything, all the ducks in a row and everything. And I guess if you wait for that, that will never be the case, right? So sometimes be a bit brave, a bit bold, and see how we go. But something we do see.
Very helpful. I am conscious, thanks for that, conscious of time. I did want to just get your very quick perspective on social media. We touched on it. Emma, you spoke about TikTok and the fact that you're seeing more and more clinicians in this part of the world wanting to be on TikTok. Where should a startup be in terms of social media when they're communicating about their product, their innovation, their technology, their brand, their value? What makes sense in Asia Pacific, Emma?
I'm not going to be invasive. I'm not trying to be deliberately invasive when I answer this question, but I'm going to say it starts with your audience. So who's the audience? That's the first question. And where are they? And what are they consuming? And that really varies market to market and also company to company. So, the use of Twitter largely in this region is not something that we use. Obviously, TikTok's huge in places like China and Indonesia, and Facebook also Indonesia, but less so here in Singapore. And you've got all of these differences. So it's like
WeChat, of course, in
China. And I would say it does dominate, and it's more than a social media platform. Let's not forget that. So I think but I think there was maybe a question on the cohort about if you're going to be present in China, do you need WeChat? The answer is likely yes. Even from a B2B and a consumer perspective, once again, when it started many years ago, it was very consumer driven. That is not the case today. And again, it's so much more than a social media platform. We know that. It's, there's e-commerce on there, everything. So definitely need to consider the local channels. But of course, it always comes as this isn't new, this is new to the communications industry. It's the first thing you learn, where's my audience and what are they consuming? And as I said earlier, I think the one thing in Asia Pacific that is somewhat, maybe people would disagree, but look, not every market, but LinkedIn from a B2B perspective is good. You can get that regional coverage from a LinkedIn channel. But again, the consumer element of that, I would argue you really need to think about, but from a B2B perspective, absolutely. So there is a lot to think about, but it's always starting with your audience,
Makes sense.
Medical devices, we go from contact lenses, medical devices, Invisalign, plastic braces, they're all consumer. That's a very different play to a implant. So I would say start with your audience and try to find out where they are, how to reach them, and what are they consuming.
Very good, thanks. I think what we'll do is we'll come back to some of these questions here during our Q&A. I wanted to thank you both for being on our panel. Terrific discussion. Before we wrap up and say goodbye to our YouTube audience, and Laura, I'll start with you. Any sort of final tips, words of advice for either our cohort companies here or any startup that's in the medical technology space? Laura.
Well, I think align yourself with the right advisors. I know that we work with a lot of board members and investors who often, they understand how we work. They have an understanding of sometimes when their companies, when the iron is ready to strike, especially for startups that, are just very, very technology focused, very engineering focused, that kind of thing. Is just understanding, when you should, collaborate with the communications, consultant or team. I think, and I said it before, I can't overstate the importance of your narrative. That's just really, really critical. If you're going to sound like everyone else, it's going to be a very hard road ahead. So just know that, branding's not easy, thought leadership's not easy, crafting a really, really good narrative is not easy, but you don't have to do it yourself. So that's what I would say.
Thanks for that. Very, very useful advice, Laura. Thanks. And Emma.
And maybe make this a little bit specific, but I think
please,
we talk about comms, we talk about the narrative, we talk about regulations. The one thing in Asia Pacific that I would really advise as you think about market entry or, yes, communicating in any of these markets is to think about the geopolitical dynamics. This has a huge play in everything that we do now when we contextualize our messaging for local markets. There's elements of championing local brands. There's a protectionism across our markets. That is something you have to think about. And I raise that because I have a very specific example, and actually comes back to the branding, house brand on house of brands. Places like Indonesia, they are championing local brands all of the time, right? The foreign direct investment, it kind of ebbs and flows depending on the government, depending on the policies. But it's something that you have to be really, really cognizant of as you enter those markets and you communicate. I know, and just last week I spoke to a big med tech company that had actually been pushed out of Indonesia for a specific device. And they used a local one, and they actually used it for the patient. And a few weeks later, they came back and they want the international brand device because it's a premium, better quality device. And then you have to think about the patient, who's benefiting the patient outcome. So I think about protectionism, geopolitical, foreign direct investment. These are all things that you really, really have to consider. And I agree with Laura, like that messaging and the value-based care messaging today. And I have to speak very specifically to Singapore. I'm seeing a huge demand from medtech companies to think about the value-based messaging, and it is incredibly, incredibly hard to communicate. So anyone starting out now with a fresh narrative, with a new lens, got to build in the value-based messaging. Singapore is very focused, as I say, on med tech companies at the moment. They're looking at what they're reimbursing from a med device perspective, and they want to know what the value is. And you've got to focus on beyond economics, but I think Laura mentioned health economics, the patient outcomes. That's so important in the med tech industry right now. I've just seen it as based on conversations I've had in the last few weeks. Everyone wants to know, how do I communicate value beyond the dollar amount?
Absolutely. That's great feedback. And in fact, I think it was just 2 weeks ago that we did host a webinar specifically on health economics and value and communicating with payers. So absolutely critical. Thank you both so much for joining our webinar this morning. We could easily have gone on here for another hour. It was a pleasure to have you on the panel. Don't hang up. We'll come to Q&A here in just a moment, but we'll part ways with our YouTube viewers. So thank you to those of you who followed us on YouTube, and tune in again on the 12th of October when we'll talk about manufacturing design and engineering.